Welcome to English Country Life. On the 7th of November 2022, a housing order for all poultry came into effect in England. In the November episode of our series, The Chicken Year Month by Month, we covered what we did to put the chickens into their fully netted enclosure. But the housing order is part of a wider requirement. And what we're going to do in this video is cover all of the aspects. So it's a whistle-stop tour. If you keep chickens and have less than 500, of exactly what you need to do to make sure that you're legally compliant with the avian and influenza requirements. My name's Fiona, and as you can see, we have a housing order in place. We live in England and lockdown is in full operation, so all poultry, whether that's chickens, ducks or geese, have to be kept either indoors or in fully netted enclosures. We put out a November episode of our series The Chicken Year Month by Month, and as a result of that we've had lots of questions across our various social media channels on whether a netted enclosure is permissible, because the press releases from both DEFRA and AFA both say chickens and poultry need to be kept indoors. However, I printed off the actual housing order, the full requirements, and what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through step by step, because netted enclosures are permissible, but there may be other bits and pieces which you might have missed. So I'm going to take you through everything we've done and you can see what is required to comply with a housing order. The document is made up of a lot of schedules. Some are relevant to chicken keepers and some aren't. For example, Schedule 6 relates to birds of prey. Clearly not relevant to chickens, but it's worth going through the schedules one by one. Schedule 1 is all about biosecurity, and what that's designed to do is to reduce the spread of virus, either us taking the virus into the chickens or for us taking the virus from the chickens to other poultry in other areas if we had ducks or geese elsewhere. So what's it asking us to do? Well, the first thing is to have suitable footpaths at entrances and exits to the chicken area, and we only have one entrance, and we've got this hot gate which takes us into an area which then allows us to get into the netted enclosure. We've actually installed this, which is actually an old gravel tray, and we've got a plank of wood over the top because then that stops rain diluting the disinfectant in the gravel tray. And in there we've put a piece of astroturf which allows us to actually scrape off anything that's on the bottom of our shoes. But in there we've put water and a DEFRA approved disinfectant. Now, what's a DEFRA approved disinfectant? Well, there's two which are actually quite readily available. There's Virkon S, which a lot of poultry keepers have, and you can actually get that either in a powder form or like this in a tablet form, and we readily use that. And I'm just looking around for my other disinfectant. Here it is, and it's J's Fluid. Now, most people would recognise this, and particularly if you're a gardener, you probably use this to clean down your greenhouses at the end of the season. And at the right dilution, and there's instructions on the back, just dilute the water to that extent, and that's all you need. Now, we happen to have one other thing which we use to help us, and it's this long-handled Dex scrubbing brush, because that allows us then just to scrape off the bottom of our shoes just a little bit more effectively than the astroturf allows us to do. But that does the job. It doesn't need to be any more complicated. We only have one enclosure for our chickens, so life is really, really simple. But if you happen to have ducks and geese and chickens, and you've got them in different enclosures, you will need a foot scrub at the entrances and exits for each of those enclosures. What you'll also need to do is have freshly laundered clothes for each of those areas. Now, what you could do, and what I know a number of friends have done, is they keep a set of overalls outside the entrance to each of the enclosures, and actually have one specific for the duck enclosure, one specific for the chicken enclosure, one specific for the geese enclosure, and they actually just change out of one set of overalls into the other set of overalls that is unique to that enclosure. Because you've got to remember, Schedule 1 is designed to ensure that the avian influenza virus can't be carried from one set of poultry or birds to another set of birds, and that would meet the criteria. Rodent control is a requirement of Schedule 1, but what does that actually mean? Well, we have these poison bait station boxes, and we've got some for mice, and this one is one that is for rats. And if we see evidence of mice or rats, we will put these out. Now, it has to be said that there is legislation out there which means that these bait station boxes should only be put out where you do see the evidence. So what is the evidence? Well, it will be droppings from mice or rats, or it will be that you see that they've gnawed your coops or bitten through your netting, in which case you can put these bait station boxes in place. It has to be said that Hugh's taken the time and actually done the necessary qualifications so that he can safely handle all the poisons which go in these boxes. And if you're interested in doing those qualifications, there's a link in the description down below to one of the training providers. But you could just pay a pest controller. However, we are a small holding homestead, so we're in the business of saving ourselves money. And the most cost-effective way of us handling and controlling the poisons in these bait station boxes was to do the qualifications ourselves. Schedule 1 is all about controlling the possibility of avian influenza coming into your property or even leaving the premises. And I'm stood here by our gates, and we've taken a very simple measure of just locking the gates. And that comes down to a section in the clause, the schedule, which says the movement of people, vehicles or equipment to and from the parts of the premises where poultry or other captive birds are kept is reduced to essential movements. Now, our chickens aren't actually kept near the driveway, but we're playing it safe. By locking the gates, we know who's coming into the property and we know who's leaving the property. So, if a vehicle does come in, we can actually find out if they own or keep poultry, in which case we can spray their tyres with the J's fluid solution. Or we can ask them to leave the vehicle outside the gates and just ask them to use a foot bath when they come in. Now, that's playing it safe because, as I say, our chickens aren't actually kept near the driveway. What you could do is simply have those precautions when they leave your driveway area and go to where you do keep your poultry. And that would relate to a much larger small holding where the poultry is maybe a field away from your particular driveway. It's just thinking about those precautions and making sure that you are covering yourself should somebody visit you who does keep other poultry. Now, what you are required to do is keep a note of people who enter and exit your premises. So that would be names and addresses and dates and times. And that's so that if avian influenza does happen to infect your flock, the inspectors can then trace it to other potential people who could be recipients of the virus. So it's just covering all of those bases. In terms of record keeping, you will need to keep a note of any sales or any purchases for poultry coming into the premises, and it does cover eggs too, so you'll have to think carefully about how you cover that. Now, if we did happen to go out and buy new chickens and bring them onto the premises, we would need to keep a note of who we bought them from, the date we bought them, how many, and the species and type of birds which are actually brought in. And we'd need to do the same if we sold any. And that covers the record keeping that we need to keep. The final clause in Schedule 1 is all about water ingress. And what that's designed to do is to make sure that the avian influenza virus isn't getting into your housing by an indirect method. And that would be from wild bird feces who happen to be infected. They poop on the roof of the shed, the barn, the coop, the stables, wherever you're keeping your chickens. And then it rains and it's actually brought into your premises by an indirect method. Now, we have these Nestera Coops, and these designs actually mean that that doesn't happen. And how do I know? That's because I poop pick these coops every single morning, so when the chickens go in to roost at night, it's beautifully clean. But that means that I am inspecting the inside of the coop and the bedding every single day. So I know if water's running down the inside or if there's damp bedding. But the design of these means that that just doesn't happen. However, if you're using a shed, an older wooden coop, a greenhouse, a barn, any of those structures, you will need to just walk around on a regular basis or inspect to make sure that there's no water running down the walls on the inside and there's no damp bedding actually leaking through the roof. And all the clause requires you to do is fix that guttering, fix that leak in the roof, actually make sure that it's less likely that when it rains in the future that there's going to be no water ingress. It's quite straightforward, really. Schedule 3 covers the housing order and it has two options. Option 1 is to keep chickens indoors, but ventilation openings must be covered by a mesh which is no wider than 25 millimetres. Now this netting is 18 millimetres and this is what we're using. We've chosen option 2, the fully netted enclosure, but there are some things to consider if this is the route you're going to go down. This is an archway outside of the fully netted enclosure, and normally we would have sparrows, robins, blackbirds, even pigeons actually sitting on the top of this archway. Now one of the things we need to do as part of the requirements to keep our chickens in a netted enclosure is take proactive measures to prevent wild birds from entering the area. So what we've done is we've taken a couple of measures. The first is we have got these CDs which spin around and they actually do scare off the wild birds. So since putting these up, that we've had no birds at all sitting on this archway. These things just hang from string and just spin around. But I appreciate not everyone has CDs anymore because everyone listens to digital things. So there is another option and let me show you that. A simple streamer is really easy to make. All you do is take a bamboo cane and use one of the feed sacks that you already have on the property. Secure the cane in place by some duct tape just around one of the corners. Then turn the feed sack around, and all you need to do then is use a pair of scissors to cut and shred the feed sack into lengths of streamer. Very, very simple. Very, very effective. And as you can see, it seems to work actually quite well when there's a gust of wind. These fronds actually blow up in the air and it does put off any wild birds entering this area because they don't know what's going on. And I can place it just a little bit further away from the netted enclosure so it doesn't scare the chickens, but it does stop wild birds coming into their netted enclosure. So as you can see, it is actually a little bit of a distance from the netted enclosure at the moment, but still the wild birds don't want to come anywhere near this. Under Schedule 3, we're required to keep food and bedding, which are kept long term, indoors, and this is what we do. So this is a bag of mixed corn which I've got, and those are actually stored here in metal barrels. So rodents can't possibly access that. That is a great way of storing it. Now you may not be able to do that. You might have plastic dustbins. Now providing there's no rodents, that evidence of rodents in the area, that should be sufficient. But you do need to have effective rodent control in the barn. The most difficult type of bedding to secure are open straw bales. So you really need to think about, if you have got straw bales and they are in a barn setting, how are you preventing rodents from accessing that straw? We have shavings, so we have compressed shavings bales, and they're all surrounded in a plastic shrink wrap. So if there is any mice or rats happen to get into the barn, which we don't have that problem, we can easily see that there's an issue with individual bales because the plastic will be gnawed and pulled apart, in which case that bale of shavings gets used in a different way. It's probably going to get used in the garden as some kind of mulch instead, but it does not go into the chicken area and does not go anywhere near it. So it is something to think about, those requirements under Schedule 3. To prevent wild birds flying over and pooping in your drinkers, all drinkers need to be kept under cover, and this is our solution. We've adapted a shelter, and as you can see, the drinkers underneath, and the chickens have to come in through the entranceway to access and drink the water. Food must be kept under cover too, and we have these treadle feeders. As you can see, it takes an adult hen to stand on the treadle to access the food. The great thing about these feeders is, in addition, when the lid is open, if a bird happens to be flying over and poops through the mesh above, it cannot enter the food because that lid still provides a shelter to the food below. It's a great solution to the problem of keeping food under cover. An alternative would be to adapt another shelter in the same way as we have for the drinkers. Of course, with food, if you're going to add treats like this, a mega pecker, there's then a question of what do you do to prevent feces from wild birds actually dropping from the sky onto the mega pecker. Now if you can put a tarpaulin over the top of your enclosure or clear plastic sheeting, that solves the problem. But we live in Lincolnshire, and Lincolnshire is a county of incredibly high winds, and that would just act as a wind sail and could put the entire enclosure at risk. So what we've done instead is a much simpler solution, and let me just scan up and hopefully you can see this. I've actually inserted just a simple square of clear plastic. Now it's not enough to act as a wind sail, but it's more than enough to prevent wild bird feces dropping onto that megapecker below, so the chickens can still enjoy their treats. If you're opting for a fully netted enclosure as we have, Schedule 3 also requires some extra bits and pieces. So the netting, just like the netting covering entranceways and ventilation for indoor areas, that netting must be under 25 millimetres in size. So our netting, as I said earlier, it's 18 millimetres in diameter, so we are within the criteria. It also requires that we come around every single day and check for any fecal matter or for feathers which could have got in from wild birds, and we need to remove those. Now, to be on the safe side, I do that for all fecal matter and all feathers. Thank you for interrupting, Taffy, that's really good of you. Excuse the clucking chicken. And the final thing to consider under that schedule is if you've got ducks or geese and you want them to have access to standing water, those areas need to be fenced off and meshed over too. So that's everything under Schedule 3 that you need to consider. If you're a backyard poultry keeper, the only other schedule which will be relevant to you will be Schedule 7, and that basically says the Avian Influenza Prevention Zone and Housing Order relates to the whole of England. Now if you're in the UK and you live in either Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, you will need to check out your local government website for further information on any restrictions which apply to you. But you might be wondering, what about the other schedules? Because I've jumped from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 to Schedule 7. Well, Schedule 2 relates to poultry keepers who have more than 500 birds, and that's clearly not us, but it may be you, and if it is, you'll need to check out that schedule for yourself. Schedule 4 relates to aquariums and zoos. Schedule 5 relates to keepers of racing pigeons or doves. Schedule 6 relates to keepers of birds of prey, so if any of those relate to you, you'll need to check out those schedules for yourself. If you have found this content useful, take a moment to give me a thumbs up down below. If you're not already a subscriber to our channel, hit subscribe and the bell icon, and you'll get to know of every new video as soon as it goes live. It's a completely free service to all of our subscribers. If you've got a question for me which hasn't been answered in this video, leave it in the comment section and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, or even make a video for you. That's how this video came about, from a subscriber question. But for now, thanks for watching and I look forward to seeing you next time.